Hello, hello. Today we are talking about the cell cycle. Now, the cell cycle is essentially the life cycle of a cell. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you're watching from my class, be sure to pause the video, go access the lesson on the hub, and watch this YouTube video because it describes how people used to believe things came to be in the world, that being by spontaneous generation. If you recall from last week, we talked about cell theory, and one of the major concepts of cell theory was that cells arise from pre-existing cells. Okay, so what does that even mean? Well, let's jump into the cell cycle. So here is the cell cycle. I'll break it down for you, don't worry. I'm sure it's overwhelming right now. This section right here in our teal, purple, and orange is known as interphase. So that is the biggest section. Notice that. Interphase is broken down into our G1, which is our first growth. So G is growth, 1 is first, so first growth phase. In this phase, the cell grows and makes proteins and organelles. So growth is what is occurring in this phase. In our next phase, we have our synthesis phase. So here we have growth, here we are synthesizing. Remember, synthesizing means to make. So here we are making a copy of the DNA. So we're copying all of the DNA that exists in the cell. And of course, our DNA is our sort of genetic makeup. It's what programs the cell to do everything, from making proteins, how to build organelles, and just basically how to exist and be a cell. So first growth phase is G1, synthesis phase is S, and second growth, so G2 phase, in this phase, the cell grows and makes organelles specific for cell division. So basically, centrioles is an example of that. So during interphase, G1, S, and G2, the cell is growing, making copies, and just generally preparing for cell division. Cell division is reproduction, and remember, that is a key aspect of a living thing. So we spend tons of time in interphase getting ready just to divide our cells, and that's in mitosis. We'll talk more about mitosis in the next lesson, but basically mitosis can be broken down into prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. Altogether, I remember them as IP-MAT. So interphase, prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and that should be a telophase. MAT. So here is another slide showing us the cell cycle again, but in a little bit more detail this time, or a little bit different detail. So here we have G1, followed by S, followed by G2, and mitosis. Notice G1 was where we grow and sort of duplicate all of the contents of the cell. So everything is duplicated except the chromosomes. And chromosomes are sort of how DNA is bundled in the cell when a cell is getting ready for mitosis. And so in S phase of interphase, the chromosomes are duplicated. So here we have our sort of cell fillings duplicated or growing. Here we have simply the DNA or the chromosomes duplicated. And here we have final checks just to double check these chromosomes aren't wrong in any way, let's say. And we also have any organelles required for mitosis. So we're always getting ready for that mitosis. Notice over here we have G0 phase, or cell cycle arrest. So this cell cycle arrest phase, or here it says go phase, which is a bit ironic given what the phase actually is basically where cells just stop. They're existing, they're living, they're doing all of the functions and processes that a cell is supposed to do, except it is not getting ready for division. So they're doing everything a cell needs to do, but it's not getting ready for division. Examples of that are nerve cells in the brain. Once the brain is developed, we stop creating new nerve cells. And so these cells will not re-enter the cell cycle. So at any given point of time, most human cells will be in this cell cycle arrest phase, because that's just where most cells are spending their time. And eventually they'll enter the cell cycle and begin the process of mitosis, or cell division. And finally, to complete our life cycle of the cell, we have cell death. Now, all things living must come to an end or death. When we're talking about cells, we often talk about two different types of death. The first is necrosis, which is death due to external factors. So something has happened to sort of hurt the cell to the point that it either dies or cannot be repaired. And so things like toxins, infections, or trauma can cause necrosis of the cells. The other type of cell death is apoptosis, which is basically when a cell commits suicide. So it's a controlled death of an old cell or a cell that is no longer useful. An example of a cell that might not be useful anymore is white blood cells, an excess of white blood cells in your bloodstream after an infection, which means the infection has already been dealt with and there's no longer a purpose for these white blood cells to be hanging out. So that's our lesson on the cell cycle. Next lesson, we'll get into more detail about mitosis.